In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. I am open and ready to listen and discuss all ideas that will actually work.
President Trump, reacting to last weekend's mass shootings, will ask a distinguished member of Congress about Trump's response, what needs to be done, and much more in a moment. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Also on the agenda, a fascinating time in New York politics. Mayor de Blasio making a long shot, some say pointless run for president, progressives lining up to challenge incumbent House Democrats, and a wild race for Queens DA that finally has a winner 6 weeks after the voting. Former City Council Speaker Christine Quinn, Times reporters Jeff Mays and Matt Flegenheimer will weigh in. But we begin with Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York's 12th District, first elected in 1992. She sits on the powerful Financial Services and Oversight Committees. She took up the case of the 9/11 first responders early, reintroduced the bill to extend the Never Forget the Heroes Act, which funds health care and victims' compensation. Comedian Jon Stewart's angry testimony helped Maloney drive the bill through Congress.
They responded in 5 seconds. They did their jobs with courage, grace, tenacity, humility. 18 years later, do yours.
That bill is now law, but the Democratic caucus is facing major challenges, including a deep division over impeachment, what to do about guns, mass shootings, white supremacists after last weekend's shocking massacres. Let's start with an easy one, Congresswoman. Impeachment, yes or no? Should Congress decide, should the House decide, or should the American voters decide?
Well, we are investigating now. We have 7 committees conducting investigations. On June 15th, the day after President Trump went on national television and said openly that he would accept help from a foreign power, would accept information that would help his campaign. The next day I came out for impeachment hearings to go forward. That's clearly a violation of our laws and an impeachable offense. When you combine that with the Mueller report that points out well over 8 impeachable offenses for obstruction of justice, and something we're confronting now in Congress every day. We have 5 committees conducting investigations, yet they are stonewalling everything. The president has taken the unusual step of even suing chairmen that are asking for legitimate witnesses, subpoenas, information for them to conduct oversight. This was one of the impeachable offenses against former President Nixon, and another clearly impeachable offense. And the New York delegation has been involved in fighting with the president over the census, and he clearly lied on issues both small and large, but on the census was claiming that he added the citizenship question in order to help the census get a more accurate count when it was just the opposite. It would result in an undercount, and it wasn't a smoking gun, it was a written confession. The documents showed from political operatives that they were adding it to have an undercount, therefore underrepresentation and unfairness in funding formulas for minorities.
Let me ask you a totally
Outrageous.
unfair question. If you had to vote on articles of impeachment today on the basis of what you know, yes or no?
Oh, yes. We have 119 members of Congress have come out for impeachment hearings to move forward. The president, or rather the chairman of the committee, Gerald Nadler, has said that he's reviewing it and may have articles of impeachment ready by late fall or early winter. So it seems to be moving forward in the House. This, of course, is an individual decision of every member of Congress.
We've seen massacres, we've seen mass shootings, we've seen cries about white nationalism, white supremacism. This past week, among others, Elizabeth Warren has called the president a white supremacist. You know him from New York, you now know him from Washington. Is he a white supremacist?
I think he's clearly a racist. I think his language, even from the first days of announcing for president, where he called Mexicans rapists, and he uses divisive, horrible language. You expect a leader to be unifying, to have a vision that brings the country together, makes us stronger, has us work. He divides us and he attacks, and his rhetoric really fuels divisions and hatred in our country, and he should stop.
Yet, Nate Cohn reported in the Times this past week that his popularity has increased since 2016. How do we account for that, and what do the Democrats have to do in this very small window before the 2020 election affirmatively to tell the American people that they can do a better job? What kind of legislation do you have to pass in Congress to say, this is our agenda, it's not just against Trump?
Well, we've passed a number of bills, H.R. 1 on reform of government and all kinds of things. But the issue that's on everyone's mind right now are these mass murders. It's really a crisis, and we stand alone in the world in terms of having these mass shootings. And the Democrats, unlike many issues where we don't know what the answer is, we know what the answer is. When New Zealand had a mass shooting, within a week they were called into office. They passed bills to take guns off the street to hold people accountable. And in this last weekend, the police did their job. They shot the guy within 30 seconds. But in 30 seconds, he killed 10 people and injured over 30. Mowed him down because he had a military-style weapon. These military weapons should be banned. These massacre magazines should be banned. We should have background checks. In fact, Democrats have passed H.R. 8 requiring background checks so that guns don't fall into the hands of dangerous people. It is sitting on the desk of Mitch McConnell. He should come back into office immediately and work to pass these bills. The president should call for that. And if he doesn't, then he's standing with the status quo, which is killing people. His inaction is literally killing people. And if guns made us safer, we would be the safest nation on earth. We have more guns per capita than any country on earth.
But with all the things you're talking about, which may be perfectly valid, we're never going to get rid of the guns that are already out there, are we?
Well, you could pass laws to hand them in. We could do gun exchanges, sure. But you've got to start somewhere. Mm-hmm. You've got to start somewhere. We are just letting this happen, and it doesn't have to happen. Young people are afraid to go to school. They're mowing them down in schools, in synagogues, in churches. You can't go to Walmarts. This is something we can do something about to protect our people. And I think it's a national crisis and a national scandal that the president isn't calling Congress back into session as other heads of countries have. Japan doesn't have any murders. Their police don't even carry guns. England had some mass shootings. They passed laws to protect themselves. Australia had a mass shooting. They immediately passed gun safety laws. We have the laws in. I have 8 that I've written myself. We have the material, the laws ready to go. Let's pass them and protect our people.
As we said earlier, you were instrumental in passing the 9/11 claims fund. Obviously, there are other things the Democrats have to do on their agenda before 2020. Looking for a nominee to run against the president, assuming, of course, he seeks re-election, do you want a nominee who is going to represent change or continuity? Which wing of the party should that nominee represent?
Oh, I think it should be both, because you're going to be moving forward, and that always means change. But you need to bring the country with you, and you have to have the support of the people. This election will truly be, I believe, the most important in my lifetime. We need to bring a change. I am for whatever candidate is the strongest to defeat President Trump.
And who is that?
We're going to find out when we hit these primaries.
And how important is a running mate, and how important is it to have a woman or a person of color on that ticket one way or another?
I think the running mate is incredibly important. Vice President Biden was a close and trusted friend to President Obama. They worked hand in hand on issues. Former Vice President Biden was very effective in working with Congress to help get the affordable health care plan through and other important bills. So I think it's very important. Personally, what I would like to see more than anything is competence, and certainly a vision for the future and ideas of how to address the problems, and a track record to run on.
Have you seen that yet in any of the 20 or so who are running?
Oh, I'm interested in several of them. I think the easiest way to predict what someone will do in the future is what have they done in the past? What have they accomplished? Not what they say, but what they've accomplished, and have they brought real change and brought the country with them on their ideas that have helped to make us stronger and better.
Thanks
and
for
more
joining
unified.
us. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, and coming up next, de Blasio running for president, progressives coming after incumbent House Democrats, a deep dive into New York politics. This is an extraordinary time in New York politics. The mayor's run for president looks like a futile fantasy. Meanwhile, a new Siena College poll finds only 26% of New Yorkers have a favorable opinion of de Blasio. Fired up progressives mounting primary challenges to incumbent House Democrats, including committee chairs Jerry Nadler and Eliot Engel, and the race for the Democratic nomination for Queens DA finally over 6 weeks after the voting. The progressive insurgent lost by only 55 votes. Who better to sort all of this out than former City Council Speaker Christine Quinn, now vice chair of the New York State Democratic Committee. We're also joined by Jeff Mays, Metro political reporter for The Times, and New York Times political reporter Matt Flegenheimer, who reports on de Blasio in this Sunday's Times magazine on nytimes.com. Christine, tell us, how do you reconcile those two wings of the party? There was an op-ed piece in the Times the other day that said over the past 9 months, the so-called squads members have made good on their promises to be agents of change, not just fresh faces. So how do you reconcile continuity with change? How do you strike that balance? How do you get rid of a Joe Crowley who has seniority in the House and recognize the fact that people also want something new, something fresh, something that relates to them?
Well, you know, in some ways, what we're seeing right now is a very typical political story, right? That people always want change. You know, it's usually why when a party leaves the White House, the next party comes in. That's an oversimplification, but people always want change, even when they vote in continuity. So for incumbents, it's important to know, one, you have to always pay attention to the base. Tip O'Neill said it, all politics are local. But you have to do that while also, given the incredible stakes with this hideous, horrible, evil man in the White House, that you need to have a national vision and be aggressive at the same time right now. And the ideas that have worked, many of them can continue to work. But that times have changed generally in this country as you look at things like income inequality and racial inequality, so things do need tweaking. I don't say like Medicare or Medicare for all. I don't feel, but maybe I'm naive, though usually not called that, this huge like battle within the party. I feel like there's a discussion, and a lot of the discussion really is about how to get more things done and what the best models are.
Jeffrey, do you see a battle within the party, or is the race in Queens, both those congressional and DA's races, aberrations, or do we see real threats to members of Congress like Eliot Engel, Gerald Nadler, and others coming up in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with you a bit. I think there is a real movement within the party. There are a lot of people, especially younger people, questioning, the Democratic machine and what they've done, what they've accomplished. I think if you look at the Queens DA's race, Tiffany Caban lost, but she did push Melinda Katz left on several issues, such as, marijuana prosecution and, how she would handle certain criminal cases. Melinda had to shift based on what Tiffany was saying. And now you're looking at Cy Vance in Manhattan, the DA there. he has at least 2 challengers at the moment. So I think
If he seeks re-election.
if he chooses to seek re-election, right? And I think you're seeing that there has been something happening since AOC was elected, that it is a ripple effect, and I think it will continue.
She has done an extraordinary job. I mean, there's just no question about that. Because when a race like that happens, you can think, okay, she's, the 15 minutes of fame, right? The color of the month or whatever. But that's not the case. And she deserves a lot of recognition for that, which I think is noteworthy, you're right, and different than sometimes we've seen these quote unquote moments in the past.
Well, how as
This
a
one is
party
that
official
statement.
do you sort of hose her down and say,
You don't. Why would
not so
you?
fast?
Why would you?
Well,
You want that energy. You want that excitement. You want that out there. Does it mean that everybody else in the party is going to think this or that should move at the exact same pace? No, but the issues she's talking about, income inequality, climate change, criminal justice, they are the issues that are at the bedrock of our party. And I don't think you should ever, if you're in a leadership position, try to control organic energy and real commitment.
Matt, we've seen John Lindsay, we've seen Rudy Giuliani think that going out of the city, going the farther away they go from New York, the more popular they're going to be. Didn't work for them. It doesn't seem to be working for Mayor de Blasio. What kind of reception is he getting? You say that once a progressive hero, he now seems to be becoming a punching bag. Why is that?
Certainly in the city, I think there are some parallels, obviously, to some of the past mayors who've run for president. I think in the mayor's case, it's been sort of a years-long effort to build a national profile, to sort of position himself as almost a referee of the left. You saw with his nonprofit during the 2016 race, getting involved in local elections in 2014. There's always been some sort of political edge to a lot of what he's been doing while in office. I think for a lot of New Yorkers, they have sensed that to some degree and have recognized that for all the work he's doing locally, he certainly has sort of cast his gaze elsewhere. On the national level, obviously now he is in a very crowded primary with a lot of very progressive competitors who are national figures unto themselves, who have had platforms in the Senate or elsewhere, former vice president, coming in as another mayor, saying a lot of the same sorts of things as some of the other candidates. It's hard to break out for anybody, and certainly for somebody who brings the amount of baggage that you carry as a very highly scrutinized New York City politician. That is certainly something that not every politician has had to deal with in this race for the past 5.5 years.
You can argue that it was gutsy or no lose to go on Sean Hannity the other day. He was the only Democratic nominee or Democratic candidate so far to do that. Why is he running?
I think he'd like to be president.
We may need a couch for that, but barring that.
Did you edit out the long pause there?
Well,
I think,
or is there nothing to lose?
I think in his case, short of becoming the president of the United States, which I'm sure is his goal, having a platform to talk about the issues that he wants to talk about, to move the conversation to the left, which we talked about in the local race, I think that is a unique chance. He will probably not have the platform equivalent to this after his second term is up. This is probably the last presidential cycle that will make any sense whatsoever for him to jump into. I think we've seen over the years in both parties, there are a sort of finite number of actual winners in a presidential campaign, but many people who benefit from having run. You can do very well for yourself financially, politically. Your sort of post-presidential prospects improve if you run and acquit yourself somewhat well, even if you don't actually win.
Jeffrey, in Matt's piece in the magazine, he says that de Blasio feels that the press hates him. Is that true?
Absolutely. They feel they've got...
Is it true he feels that way, or is it
Because
true the
every
press
elected
hates him?
official feels that way
Right.
at times.
Well,
Yeah, but he feels that way all the time. Is he
Yeah.
right about that?
I wouldn't say the press hates him. I mean, this is a tough place to be a politician. You have a very rigorous press corps here, a very devoted press corps. And I think that's good. That's good for our democracy. That's good for New York City. That's good for the country. What they feel is that they've not gotten a fair shake. They feel
The de Blasio
yes,
administration.
they feel they've been targeted by the New York Post or the Daily News sometimes. And even they complain about the New York Times even, about their coverage in those papers. And the response to the mayor has been, well, look, you have not shown an enthusiasm for this job as past mayors have. You know, Ed Koch would come down to Room 9 and talk to reporters. You know, Bloomberg was grumpy in his own sort of way, but still, you know, still engaged with reporters. And the mayor has made it clear, we've seen his emails, how he feels about the press, that they're almost a hindrance to what he's trying to do. And certainly I think that has affected his view now nationally, even as he goes to run for president.
All right, Christine, you ran against him for the
Twice.
Democratic nomination.
Beat him once, but not the second time.
Okay, but
who's
but
counting?
let's ask the fundamental question. Like him, don't like him, want to go out and have a drink with him or not, care which gym he goes to. Has he done a good job as mayor?
I think there's a lot of things he's done very well. I mean, when I was running against him, never thought, although a huge pre-K supporter, I never thought it could be rolled out as quickly as he wanted it to. So I give him a lot of credit on that. The steps we've seen around Rikers and that issue, you know, that was a very bold position. There are parts of the Bronx where I do work for Wynn where they do actually hate him, so that was bold. I think coming forward during his reelect and announcing the Turning the Tides plan to build 90 new shelters was also a very brave thing. So there's certainly significant highlights in his tenure.
How would you rate him on a scale of 1 to 10 as a
Look,
mayor?
I went to Catholic school, so, you know, you're not allowed to give anybody good ratings based on Sister Mary Ferocious. So,
All right, let's talk very briefly about the presidential race. We talked about local Congress members who are facing possible insurgents. On the national scene, do you want to see a candidate who looks like they represent change or looks like they represent continuity? Obviously, we can fit people into those categories fairly or not.
well, you know, not to sound too much like an ex-politician, you kind of want both, right? You want people who see a vision, who have a vision, but also recognize there's good stuff that has been done by the left in the past that you can bring along. I most importantly want someone who can win. Now, I think it's only, you know, continuity or whatever that can win. That's a different debate, and I think one worth having, and I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the schools of thought out there right now, but we have to win. There is literally the devil incarnate in the White House. He has done horrible things over and over. We just saw him at a Wynn shelter, not himself, thank God, but his ICE deportation squad show up.
Win meaning?
Wynn is, I'm so sorry, Women in Need, the shelter and homeless organization I run. The list is too long of what he's done. And think if he's in there as a goddamn lame duck, he will make the past few years look like a walk in the park. We have to win. It is not always our greatest strength as Democrats.
Thanks to Christine Quinn and thanks to my New York Times colleagues, Jeff Mays and to Matt Flegenheimer for joining us. And coming up next on CODA, I'll add some thoughts on another campaign. Back in the day, presidential campaigns unofficially began on Labor Day. By Labor Day 2019, nearly 24 Democratic candidates will already be grizzled veterans. Some will probably have already given up. Before we get consumed by Trump versus Trump in 2020, let's take the summer to reflect on a brief interlude 50 years ago when politics was fun. I'm thinking of Norman Mailer's race for mayor in the 1969 Democratic primary. Mailer may have been the greatest writer since Winston Churchill to seek elective office. His three-word campaign slogan, though, was unprintable, a vulgarization of "no more bull." Moreover, with crime at the top of every candidate's agenda, Mailer had to justify a chink in his law and order armor. He had been convicted of stabbing one of his wives. If the collective mentality of the electorate was that of Alice B. Toklas, Mailer's campaign manager, Joe Flaherty said, "We were home an easy winner." In the end, Mailer ran fourth in a five-way primary with 41,000 votes. Arguably, with two conservatives as the Democratic and Republican nominees that November, the primary outcome let John Lindsay slip by for a second term as a liberal. Mailer made the eventual nominee, Mario Procaccino, look ridiculous. And by advocating statehood for New York City, he validated Lindsay's claim that the mayoralty was the second toughest job in America. Mailer's running mate for city council president was the columnist Jimmy Breslin. After the election, he pronounced himself mortified to have taken part in a process that required bars to be closed. Given the subsequent success of the two candidates as writers, I remember asking Breslin, wasn't it lucky that they lost? It wasn't luck, he replied. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.